I always believed that moving to a quiet, picturesque neighborhood under the watchful gaze of a well-organized HOA meant stability, friendliness, and a sense of community. But then again, I never fully accounted for the presence of Karen. Yes, that Karen. The kind who takes it upon herself to regulate every blade of grass, every paint color, and every dog's bark in a half-mile radius. Of course, no one calls her by that name to her face. She's Ms. Richardson to anyone unfortunate enough to lock horns with her. And trust me, I would have gladly lived out my days just nodding politely at her while pulling into my driveway if it spared me the headache to come. But life has a way of forcing certain showdowns. And so it was that Ms. Richardson chose to pick a fight with me over the one companion my blind son, Ethan, can't live without, his guide dog, Samson. We'd moved into Springdale Crest Estates barely a year ago, thrilled to have found a spacious single-story home that would accommodate Ethan's needs. As a single father, I'm always on the lookout for ways to help him navigate the world with confidence. Even the slightest advantage, like easy access to bus routes or parks, makes a huge difference. Samson, a golden retriever with soulful brown eyes, came into Ethan's life 2 years ago after months of training. When Ethan was 8, he was in a car accident that robbed him of his eyesight. The day I brought Samson home felt like Christmas and a birthday rolled into one. The dog's presence lit up my son's world in ways I can hardly describe. In the early days after we moved, Ms. Richardson was cordial enough. She'd wave from her porch, perch behind meticulously trimmed rose bushes, and offer a good day whenever we walked by. But her polite facade cracked the first time Samson stepped on her lawn. It was an honest mistake. Ethan was still memorizing his new surroundings, and the dog was adjusting as well. I apologized profusely, offered to pick up any dog mess on the spot. There was none, and explained Samson's role. Ms. Richardson's lips were pressed so tight they nearly disappeared. She just shrugged and said, "We have standards here, sir," in an icy tone, then retreated behind her door. I try not to dwell on it. As it turned out, Ms. Richardson was the self-appointed enforcer of our homeowners association, unofficially at least. She wasn't the official HOA president, but she was on the board, possessed a formidable knowledge of the bylaws, and, by all accounts, acted like the neighborhood's disciplinarian. If your hedge was a quarter-inch too tall, she'd send a letter. If your trash can lingered on the curb past 6 p.m., you'd get a formal complaint. For weeks, I kept my head down and complied with every trivial rule I learned about, desperate to avoid any confrontation. I even measured the distance between my fence pickets to ensure everything was up to regulation. Then one afternoon, Ethan and Samson were playing in our front yard. Samson wearing his harness, as recommended whenever Ethan is with him. Ethan loved the safety of that harness. It was his lifeline. My boy would throw a ball a short distance, feel for Samson's subtle movements through the harness, and the dog would guide him with gentle tugs so that Ethan could track the ball. It was a clever system taught by their trainer, and watching it in action nearly brought tears to my eyes. My son was laughing, playing, and participating in a moment of normalcy that so many take for granted. Ms. Richardson materialized at the edge of our driveway, arms folded. "Your dog is off-leash on common property," she declared, pointing accusingly. Samson was on our front lawn, private property behind a small picket fence, but she insisted the dog's nose had gone over the boundary, meaning Samson was technically on common ground. I calmly told her that Samson was still in training with Ethan, well within my yard, and under control at all times. She gave me a pinched look and strutted away. I thought that was the end of it, just another warning to add to the pile. But something in her tone that day gave me a chill, that sense of an oncoming storm. Later that week, I received a notice from the HOA about improper supervision of animals. It was vague, referencing an incident involving a dog and a neighbor's property line. Furious, I typed out a formal response detailing how Samson is a properly licensed guide dog for a legally blind minor. I even included references to local disability protection ordinances, hoping to nip this nonsense in the bud. Yet the official letter from the association politely but firmly insisted that all matters regarding animals must be brought into compliance with community standards, and that failure to do so could result in fines. I was exasperated, but not yet alarmed. If they wanted to quibble over a line in the grass, so be it. I'd fight that with reason and documentation. But as I would soon learn, Ms. Richardson was just getting started. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Ethan and Samson were in the backyard practicing orientation drills, and I heard the unmistakable sound of Ms. Richardson's voice drifting over the fence. She was speaking to someone official, and it sounded like she was describing a dangerous dog that threatened the safety of neighborhood children. At that moment, I realized the stakes were higher than I ever imagined. Calling a dog dangerous can have serious repercussions, further investigations, forced removals, or even euthanasia in the worst cases. My heart pounded. Samson was gentle, well-trained, and a critical lifeline for my son's independence. Losing him would devastate Ethan. There's no way she'd be so extreme. I tried to reassure myself, but dread coiled in my stomach. No one wants to believe a person in their community could be so malicious. But Ms. Richardson was about to prove that she meant business, and she'd chosen my son's guide dog as her target. The morning after I overheard Ms. Richardson's ominous phone call, I found a business card tucked under our front door. It read, County Animal Services, Officer Delgado. At first, I felt a wave of confusion. Our new vet records were all up to date. Samson was licensed, vaccinated, and thoroughly documented as a service animal. There was no legitimate reason for animal control to be on my doorstep. But Ms. Richardson's words from the previous evening echoed in my mind. Could she really have concocted a complaint so severe that animal control was obligated to follow up? I pocketed the card and rang the number. Officer Delgado answered immediately, sounding polite but businesslike. We received a call from a resident in your community expressing concern about a large dog with alleged aggressive behavior, he explained. The nature of these allegations requires a site visit. We need to ensure that any reported threats to public safety are addressed. I swallowed hard, anger sparking in my chest. I calmly informed him that Samson was a trained guide dog, that my son is visually impaired, and that we'd welcome any inspection needed to clear Samson's name. I appreciate the transparency, Mr. Lawson, Delgado replied. We just want to close the file with no loose ends. Would you be available this afternoon? I agreed, hanging up with a queasy mix of dread and determination. Immediately, I called my lawyer, an old friend who helped navigate the labyrinth of disability services when Ethan first lost his sight. She assured me that we had plenty of legal ground to stand on and recommended having all paperwork ready. Samson's training certifications, vaccination records, licensing forms, and the relevant sections of the Americans with Disabilities Act ADA. I laid it all out on our dining room table, then waited. When the animal services truck pulled up, Ms. Richardson was in her front yard. Her glare was so intense, I swore I felt it through the window. Delgado was a middle-aged man with a kindly face, wearing a uniform that suggested more wildlife ranger than law enforcer. He entered my home respectfully, scanning the meticulously maintained living room. Samson padded over, sniffed Delgado's pant leg, and wagged his tail. No barking, no growling, just a friendly greeting of a well-socialized dog. Mr. Lawson, may I see the dog's documentation? Delgado asked, stepping carefully around the furniture. Ethan, perched on a couch, fidgeted nervously with the corner of a Braille magazine. Samson lay obediently at his feet, harness in place. I produced the folder of documents, and Delgado reviewed them, pausing here and there to read a certification or note the vet signature. Eventually, Delgado nodded. Everything looks in order. I'll need to observe the dog's behavior around your son, just for my report. We've had an increase in false allegations involving service animals lately. False allegations? I repeated, an eyebrow arching. So, this kind of thing happens often. He gave me a rueful smile. Happens more than you'd think. Some people just don't like dogs, service animal or not, and they'll use the system to cause trouble. It's unfortunate because it wastes resources and causes undue stress to folks like you. I asked Ethan if he minded showing Delgado how Samson guided him around the house. My son dutifully stood, placed a hand on the harness, and commanded Samson to lead him to the kitchen. The dog responded instantly, moving slowly but confidently, guiding Ethan around the corner of the coffee table and through the hallway without incident. Delgado watched with open admiration. "That's a fantastic dog," he said, scribbling notes. "I don't see any sign of aggression. If anything, he's exceptionally well trained." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Delgado completed his inspection of the yard, where conveniently I kept everything immaculate to avoid violating any HOA rules, and gave me the all-clear. "I'll file a report stating there's no evidence of aggression or neglect. Your dog is clearly essential for your son's disability accommodations." "That should be the end of it," he reassured. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "If there's any further harassment, you might want to consult your attorney. In my experience, some neighbors don't give up easily." He drove off, leaving me on the porch, my shoulders sagging with relief. Ms. Richardson stood on her lawn across the street, pretending to prune her rose bushes. I sensed her disappointment from the stiff way she held her clippers. She was undoubtedly hoping for a different outcome, maybe an aggressive dog label, maybe even a threat of removal. That night, as Ethan and I sat down to dinner, I tried to make light of the day. I told him the story of how, when I was a kid, my grandfather had this enormous Saint Bernard that neighbors occasionally fretted over because of its size, but that dog was a gentle giant, as harmless as a stuffed teddy bear. Sometimes, I told Ethan, people mistake big or different for dangerous. It's not Samson's fault at all. Ethan, pushing a piece of chicken around his plate, asked, "Dad, what if Ms. Richardson does this again? What if she tries to make them take Samson away?" His voice trembled. He was trying to sound brave, but I could hear the fear beneath it. I reached out and squeezed his shoulder. "Buddy, we have every legal right to keep Samson. No one can take him from us as long as we stand up for ourselves." I spoke with far more confidence than I felt. Inside, I worried that Ms. Richardson might not back down. After all, she had an entire HOA board on her side, maybe not in moral support, but certainly in rule enforcement. While most neighbors seemed friendly in passing, few were bold enough to challenge Ms. Richardson's authority. Later that night, I sat alone at the kitchen table, forming a plan. I'd attend the next HOA meeting, I decided, and speak directly to the board. The best way to neutralize Ms. Richardson's attacks was to drag her allegations into the light where everyone could see they were baseless. I had documents, the backing of animal control, and the power of disability law on my side. She couldn't deny a sworn officer's report. If this ended in a formal confrontation, so be it. I wasn't going to let one officious busybody stand between my son and his beloved guide dog. But I underestimated Ms. Richardson's cunning. This was far from over, and her next move would feel more like a surgical strike than a petty complaint. When I arrived at the monthly HOA meeting, my stomach felt like it was doing cartwheels. The gatherings typically took place in the community clubhouse, a repurposed craftsman-style bungalow in the heart of the neighborhood. It was 7 p.m. on a Thursday, and about 20 of my neighbors were scattered in folding chairs. At the front, an elongated table seated the HOA board, including Ms. Richardson. Officially, their roles were to maintain the neighborhood's aesthetic and handle communal matters like landscaping or share amenities. Unofficially, many referred to them as the Neighborhood Tribunal. I took a seat near the aisle, close enough to the front to see Ms. Richardson's tight-lipped expression. She deliberately avoided eye contact, pretending to shuffle papers in front of her. The meeting started with routine updates, maintenance budgets, signage regulations, a proposal to repaint the community swimming pool fence. Each item droned on, but my heart hammered in my chest, waiting for the real fireworks. Finally, the board chair, Mr. Alvarez, a soft-spoken man in his 60s, cleared his throat. "We have a new agenda item. Concerns raised about a dog on Maple Drive. Ms. Richardson, you requested this discussion." She stood, smoothing her skirt. "Yes, Mr. Alvarez. As you know, I've received multiple complaints, a bold claim that made me arch an eyebrow, regarding a dog owned by Mr. Lawson. There have been allegations of repeated boundary violations, noise, and potential aggression. I believe we should review whether this animal complies with our community's guidelines." I stood up, forcibly steadying my voice. With respect, Ms. Richardson, your concerns have already been addressed by County Animal Services. The officer came to my home, inspected Samson, and found no issues. In fact, I have his written report here. I held it aloft, though Ms. Richardson made no move to read it. She kept her composure. That may be so, but the HOA has its own rules. We require that dogs be kept on leashes outside the residence. Also, the breed in question is a large one. Our bylaws do not specifically ban large dogs, but we have guidelines about how they must be contained. Someone behind me coughed. Another neighbor, Ms. Lang, spoke up. Service animals are usually exempt from certain rules, right? I mean, if it's a guide dog for his son, we can't just force him to muzzle the poor dog, can we? Ms. Richardson gave an indulgent smile. We all appreciate the need for accommodations. However, the HOA has to balance one homeowner's needs against the community's safety. If there have been complaints made by you, I interrupted, struggling to keep anger out of my voice. And as for safety, the county officer who specializes in animal control found no threat. As a service animal, Samson is protected by the ADA. That supersedes any local HOA rule that tries to restrict him. I have legal counsel ready to attest to this. My gaze swept the board. I want to resolve this amicably, but if we're forced into a legal standoff, I'm prepared. A flurry of murmurs passed through the room. Mr. Alvarez adjusted his glasses and looked from Ms. Richardson to me. We certainly don't want to trample on anyone's rights. Ms. Richardson, do you have any evidence, beyond hearsay, that the dog is a menace? Because what I see here is a legitimate service animal, and the law is quite clear about how we handle that. Ms. Richardson pursed her lips. With all due respect, Mr. Alvarez, I'm concerned about the dog's future behavior. We can't wait until someone is bitten or injured, and the dog has been spotted off-leash on several occasions. Just because the dog is guiding someone doesn't mean it's immune from following the same rules. I've documented these sightings in the official log. She brandished a notebook with scribbled entries, presumably times and dates of violations. I drew a slow breath. Samson is on a harness when guiding my son, and that harness is specifically designed for visually impaired assistance. It's not the same as being off-leash. That harness acts as a leash, Ms. Richardson. The difference is Samson leads Ethan, not the other way around. Some heads nodded in understanding, but Ms. Richardson pressed on. The fact remains, we have an obligation to maintain order. If Mr. Lawson won't abide by community rules, we have the power to fine him until compliance is met. An older woman in the front row, Ms. Delaney, stood and turned toward Ms. Richardson. I've seen that dog. He's an angel. My granddaughter petted him once, and he just wagged his tail. I failed to see the hazard. Maybe you're overreacting, dear. That remark sent Ms. Richardson into a visible flush. She bristled. I'm only looking out for the community's best interest. Mr. Alvarez, sensing the tension, raised a hand for quiet. I move that we take a formal vote on whether there's cause for the HOA to impose restrictions on Mr. Lawson's service dog. Before we do, Mr. Lawson, can you confirm that you will meet the standard responsibilities of pet ownership, clean up waste, ensure the dog is supervised, and manage any noise at night? Of course, I agreed. I've done all of that from day one. Ms. Richardson stared daggers at me, but she didn't speak. One by one, the board members raised their hands. The motion to impose additional restrictions failed, 4-1. Only Ms. Richardson voted in favor. After the meeting, I felt a surge of triumph, a wave of relief that maybe this war was over. But as I exited the clubhouse, Ms. Richardson sidled up to me. In a hushed tone meant only for my ears, she hissed, "Don't think this is done. I don't like being humiliated in front of the entire board. Keep your dog on a proper leash, or you will regret it." She pivoted and stalked away, leaving me rattled. The cryptic threat hung in the air. It wasn't about the dog anymore. It was about her pride. Karen had lost a public round, and now she was itching to strike back. My mind swirled with possibilities, fines for invented offenses, official letters citing random rule infractions, anything to make my life miserable. When I returned home, Ethan was waiting in the living room, Samson at his side, quietly reading a Braille edition of a science magazine. He sensed my tension. "How'd it go, Dad? Did we win?" "We did," I said softly, rubbing Samson's ears. "But we should stay vigilant. Ms. Richardson isn't backing down yet." In that moment, I resolved to remain one step ahead of her. If she wanted to wage a petty war, I'd face her. My priority was Ethan, and no one, certainly not some power-hungry HOA busybody, would deprive him of his devoted guide dog. However, not long after, Ms. Richardson would find a way to upend that confidence. She was about to show me the full extent of her reach and the heartbreak she could cause. A tense lull fell over the next few weeks. Aside from the occasional death glare Ms. Richardson aimed at me from behind her blooming rose bushes, there was nothing out of the ordinary. No letters, no fines, no surprise visits from county officials. If I didn't know better, I'd have believed she'd finally decided to move on. But when people like Ms. Richardson feel cornered, they rarely surrender quietly. It started subtly. Some of our mail went missing. At first, I blamed the Postal Service, but then I noticed that only certain pieces vanished, mostly those from government agencies or legal offices. I had a suspicion, but no proof, so I went to the post office and arranged for a more secure delivery. Then one morning, I discovered a threatening note slipped under our doormat. The message, composed of cut-out letters from magazines, read, "We don't need a vicious animal in our neighborhood. Get rid of it or else." It was cartoonish, like something from a detective TV show, but also deeply unsettling. I reported it to the police, who took a statement but admitted they had no leads. Ethan asked me if we should be afraid. I told him we weren't going anywhere. "It's just some crank," I said, trying to hide my trembling hands. Yet everything in me screamed that Ms. Richardson was behind it. My instincts told me she was too smart to leave such an obvious trail, but was absolutely cunning enough to orchestrate it. The real blow came on a Sunday afternoon. Ethan had asked if we could walk to the park so he could use the swing set with Samson's guidance. We strolled through the neighborhood, minding our own business, when a police cruiser slowed to a stop beside us. Two officers, hands on their belts, stepped out and approached calmly. "Is there a problem, officers?" I asked, my voice tight. "We received a report of a dog attacking a child in this area," one officer explained. He glanced at Samson, who sat quietly at Ethan's side. "We need to investigate." My heart kicked into overdrive. Attacking a child? That's impossible. We've been walking peacefully. Samson's a guide dog for my son, who's blind. He wouldn't hurt anyone. The second officer nodded. "We understand, sir, but we have to follow protocol. Can you give us your ID? We need to ask a few questions." We went through the motions, explaining who we were, where we lived, the nature of Samson's training. They checked Samson's tags, which matched our home address, and confirmed he had no history of aggression. The officers radioed in their findings and, after a few minutes, apologized for the inconvenience. "Looks like a false alarm," one said. "We're sorry about that. We've had a few bogus calls around here lately. If you'd like to file a complaint about harassment, you're within your rights." As they left, I noticed Ms. Richardson's silhouette behind a lace curtain in a nearby home. She wasn't on her porch, but I knew she was watching. She must have known exactly where Ethan and I were headed, and in an underhanded maneuver, had placed a phony 911 call. I was seething. She had gone from petty complaints to full-on harassment, all because she couldn't handle losing face at the HOA meeting. Using emergency resources to harass a neighbor was not only malicious, it was illegal. I filed my own police report that same day, citing Ms. Richardson's repeated harassment. The officers politely took my statement, but as before, they reminded me that Ms. Richardson denies placing any call, and it's difficult to prove otherwise without phone records or direct evidence. When I got home, Ethan retreated to his room, upset. Samson followed, pressing his nose comfortingly against my son's leg. I watched them, heartbreaking, and resolved to do whatever it took to end this nightmare. She was risking not just my child's sense of safety, but she was misusing public services in the process. If Ms. Richardson had no qualms about lying to the police, what would she try next? I had a long phone conversation with my attorney that evening. We discussed filing a restraining order. My lawyer said it could be tricky unless we had a pattern of documented threats. Keep any notes, messages, or suspicious calls on record, she advised. In the meantime, I'll draft a formal cease and desist letter. We can send it certified mail and copy the HOA board. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. A few days later, Ms. Richardson struck again. She lodged a formal complaint with the HOA, claiming that Sampson had damaged her flower beds. Naturally, she demanded I pay to replace the rare, expensive blossoms she insisted Sampson trampled. The complaint arrived with a set of photos, grainy and inconclusive, but allegedly showing dog prints in her soil. The paw prints were huge, far bigger than Sampson's paws, and you could almost see the outlines had been pushed into the mud rather than left naturally. The entire thing was an obvious setup. I marched straight to the HOA office, brandishing the letter. The clerk, a weary-looking man named Brett, just shrugged. Ms. Richardson dropped this off this morning. She wants the board to vote on imposing a fine. She's forging evidence, I snapped. I'm not in a position to say, he replied carefully, but you have a right to dispute. There's a hearing scheduled for next week. The tension in his voice told me he wasn't exactly thrilled about Ms. Richardson's antics, but rules were rules. The board had to hear every complaint. I left, furious and exasperated, but also weirdly energized. She was doubling down, and I was going to push back even harder. My next move was to rally the neighbors I knew supported us, like Ms. Delaney and Ms. Lang, and gather testimony about how gentle Sampson was, how we strictly kept him on a harness or leash, and how Ms. Richardson had been badgering us. If she wanted a battle in the public square, I would give her one, complete with her own track record of false reports and petty sabotage. Little did I know, though, that events would soon spin in a direction Ms. Richardson never anticipated, forever altering her status as the neighborhood's self-appointed warden and granting us the vindication we deserved. The night of the damaged flower beds, hearing arrived with a crackle of anticipation. Word had spread among the residents that Ms. Richardson was pushing for fines against me, and by extension, against Ethan and Sampson. People were growing weary of her heavy-handed tactics, and curiosity drew a larger crowd than usual. When I stepped into the clubhouse, I saw at least 30 faces, some I knew well, others I recognized only in passing. Yet from the nods and small smiles of encouragement, I sensed that sentiment might be turning against Ms. Richardson. At the front of the room, the board members arranged themselves, flipping through documents. Ms. Richardson stood off to one side, an air of smug confidence radiating from her stiff posture. I braced myself for another heated confrontation, determined not to let my temper get the best of me. Mr. Alvarez called the meeting to order. We're here to address a complaint filed by Ms. Richardson against Mr. Lawson, alleging property damage caused by his service dog. Mr. Lawson, you have the floor to respond. I rose and approached the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, let's get one thing straight. Sampson never left my property unattended, nor did he enter Ms. Richardson's yard. The photos provided by Ms. Richardson are unconvincing at best. In fact, they appear fabricated. And let's not forget, Ms. Richardson has repeatedly targeted my son's guide dog with unsubstantiated claims that animal control and the local police have found to be without merit. Pausing, I surveyed the room, noticing Ms. Delaney and Ms. Lang in the crowd. I have statements from several neighbors who can attest to Sampson's calm demeanor and the measures I take to ensure he's properly supervised. If Ms. Richardson is truly concerned about the welfare of the neighborhood, she should recognize the value a service dog provides to a resident with a disability. Before I could hand the statements to the board, Ms. Richardson stepped up. If I may, she said, in a tone that suggested she believed this would be her coup de grace, I'd like to introduce some new evidence. She held up a USB flash drive. My home security camera captured footage. It clearly shows the dog in my garden. Mr. Alvarez leaned forward. All right, Ms. Richardson, let's see it. A small projector and screen had been set up for the meeting. Ms. Richardson inserted the USB drive into a laptop, and the board tech queued up the clip. Grainy night vision footage began to play. A dog-shaped silhouette tiptoed along the edge of a garden, rummaging among the flower beds. The timestamp was 2:13 a.m., and the outline was indeed large, with a similar shape to Samson. My stomach dropped. The figure in the video occasionally paused to snuffle around the flowers, eventually knocking over a few pots. Then the perspective shifted as the dog lifted its head. The reflective glow of the lens caught the animal's face. A faint hush swept through the room. One of the board members exclaimed, "That's not a golden retriever. That's a German shepherd." I exhaled, realization washing over me. Samson was a golden retriever and was lighter in color. A silhouette might look similar, but the shape of the face, the ears, was different. You could plainly see upright ears, a hallmark of German shepherds. Samson had the floppy ears typical of retrievers. Ms. Richardson sputtered, "That must be, maybe the lighting's off. It might still be the same dog." Another board member squinted at the screen. "No, look at the tail. It's too bushy to be a retriever's. And that muzzle is too narrow." Someone in the audience muttered, "That could be the Monroe's dog, Chewy. They have a shepherd." Suddenly, the crowd was abuzz with whispers. Ms. Richardson's face paled. She quickly advanced the footage, but it only worsened her case. The dog turned, revealing a shape that was unmistakably not Samson. Even Mr. Alvarez frowned at Ms. Richardson. "Is there anything else you wish to show us?" he asked pointedly. She stammered, "I must have been mislabeled. I have other clips. Just let me—" She fumbled with a laptop, but the damage was done. The board had seen enough. A triumphant warmth bloomed in my chest. I took the microphone again. "Ladies and gentlemen, you can see Ms. Richardson's so-called evidence doesn't even feature my dog. This is, at best, a careless mistake, and at worst, a deliberate attempt to mislead this community and tarnish my family's reputation." People clapped, actually clapped. Ms. Richardson's composure cracked, and for a second, she stood frozen, hands shaking around the USB drive. Then she turned on her heel and marched out of the clubhouse in a swirl of indignation, leaving the board members exchanging awkward glances. Mr. Alvarez cleared his throat. "Given this revelation, I recommend dismissing Ms. Richardson's complaint against Mr. Lawson." All those in favor. Unanimous aye votes echoed across the room. And just like that, the cloud hanging over my family lifted. In the days that followed, word spread about Ms. Richardson's humiliating display. Rumors buzzed about how she'd used that same questionable footage to file her initial complaint with the HOA and possibly to strengthen her previous calls to the police. The board demanded a meeting with her to discuss potential disciplinary action. There was talk of censuring her or even removing her from the HOA board for misconduct. Her credibility as the neighborhood's moral crusader evaporated overnight. A week later, a formal apology letter arrived in my mailbox, signed by the HOA board, though not personally by Ms. Richardson. They acknowledged that her claims were unsubstantiated and misleading, and that I had the board's support to continue caring for Samson, free of harassment or fines. I couldn't help but smile at the final paragraph, which emphasized the HOA's commitment to inclusivity and respect for all residents. Ethan took the letter in his hands, feeling the raised print of the embossed HOA seal. "So it's over, Dad? For real?" I patted Samson's head. "I think so, buddy. We have official backing now. Ms. Richardson can't push us around anymore." The relief in his face was palpable. He knelt down and wrapped his arms around Samson's neck, burying his face in the golden fur. The dog nuzzled him gently, tail wagging. A few days later, I saw Ms. Richardson in her driveway, wearing sunglasses, head tilted down as if she were avoiding my gaze. We didn't speak. There was no need. She'd lost her battle, and, with it, much of her influence. I heard whispers that the board was conducting a formal vote on her role, but I never bothered to follow up on the outcome. For me, it was enough that she would no longer threaten my son's guide dog. Life at Springdale Crest Estates returned to a comforting routine. Samson guided Ethan around the block each morning, both of them brimming with renewed confidence. Neighbors we barely knew started greeting us warmly, some offering condolences for the ordeal. Ms. Delaney even baked us cookies in celebration, proclaiming, "That was one for the books, wasn't it?" I couldn't disagree. Karen, the unstoppable neighborhood busybody, had met her match in a gentle guide dog and a community unwilling to stand by while she trampled one family's right to live peacefully. In the end, her false claims backfired in a spectacular display of irony and justice. Every time I see my son and Samson making their way down the sidewalk, I'm reminded of how vital that dog is. He's more than a pet. He's Ethan's eyes, his companion, and his ticket to independence in a world not always designed for him. No amount of HOA strong-arming can take that away. And while I'm sure Ms. Richardson will find another target someday, some trivial rule to enforce, I have faith that this neighborhood has seen through her once and for all. And so have we. The best revenge, in the end, is to keep on living your life, guided by what truly matters. For Ethan, that means trusting Samson's steady paw steps. For me, it's protecting my son's right to navigate his own path, free from the shadows of small-minded bullies. Ms. Richardson's reign over us is finished, and in the wake of her defeat, our little household has never felt more at peace. The end.